Ike went ahead with his surrender ceremony at Reims on the 7th of May that was to take effect on the 8th, and then von Friedeberg was taken to sign again in Berlin on the 8th of May while the British took Eberhard Kinzel into custody. The Berlin surrender document wasn't finished until 1:30 in the morning on the 9th, but they called it the 8th. And when the surrenders were signed, there remained a well-equipped German army of 400,000 troops in Norway and plenty more all over the world that just needed a little resupply to turn around to fight the Russians under Monty's command, and the total available was somewhere around 880,000 German soldiers. So Ike set up the Rheinwiesenlager POW camps, specifically to keep all the German POWs from joining up with the British. There were 19 of these Rheinwiesenlager enclosures where Ike called the German prisoners DEFs, or disarmed enemy forces, rather than POWs, because the Geneva Convention had lost its meaning in the face of the condition of Germany's work camps. Before the Americans had crossed the bridge at Remagen, the British and Americans had been holding an equal amount of German POWs, but after the bridge at Remagen, the British were refusing to hold any more POWs, and by the first week of May in 1945, Ike's Rheinwiesenlager holding pens contained over 3 million surrendered German soldiers. On the 9th, accusing Flensburg of failing to implement the Reims ceasefire on time, Eisenhower ordered Dönitz, Keitel, and Jodl arrested forthwith, an action held up for several days by a flurry of British objections. Eisenhower at War, page 804. On the 9th of May at 4 p.m., 20,000 Germans surrendered at Dunkirk, followed at 4:30 by the 12,000 Germans on Bornholm Island in the Baltic Sea, but they had needed to be persuaded by the Soviet Air Force, after which the 160,000 waiting in Latvia in the Kurland pocket surrendered to the Russians on the 10th of May, but the very last to capitulate in defeat were the Germans at Trieste. The Americans and the Russians, who'd met at Torgau on the Elbe, 60 miles south of Berlin on the 25th of April, had been getting along famously, and the British radio had announced the Hitler Agreement in hopes the Russians would turn on the Americans for having left Russia out of the surrender terms, but Stalin knew that the British had been all ready to go with Operation Pike on the 15th of May in 1940, and that Hitler's march into France on the 10th had put that operation on hold. Pike had been a plan for the British and the French to bomb Russia so that Stalin could not help Germany, although why not just bomb Germany? The British claimed to have hesitated to bomb Russia for fear it would make Russia join with Germany, and that would have made the Germans unstoppable. In the wake of the planning of Operation Pike on September 11, 1941, the Americans broke ground for their new military headquarters called the Pentagon, and it would be completed and open for business on the second day of the Casablanca Conference. And it is important to know that Stalin had offered Hitler the Ukraine if he would call off Barbarossa. On the night of the 9th of May in 1945, the 1st Ukrainian met up with Patton near Chemnitz, and 858,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Russians, while another 150,000 took to the road towards the west, and by the 11th of May, all battlefields went silent. The newspaper headlines had been promising more war on the 4th of May, reporting that Dönitz was determined to continue the fight against Bolshevism, but the zeitgeist of the world was that once Berlin had fallen, the war was over, and in that, Monty had been quite right. The Germans were done, and the Americans were done, and the Russians were done, and the French were done, and no matter that Monty and Churchill weren't done, the fact remained that the English and the Irish and the Welsh and the Scots were done, and so were the Danes and the Norwegians and the Belgians and the Dutch, and of course the Italians, and so it was over. Everyone took down their blackout curtains and turned on the bar lights and opened up the dance halls, while an enormous celebration swept over the whole earth, and Monty squeezed what was left of his mind through the legal language of his documents, and he transmitted a few more telegrams that were thrown in wastebaskets or simply ignored, and the sun came up, and the moon went down, and Potsdam convened to begin a new world, as the State of Israel would be born on the 14th of May in 1948, and it had been a hard winter, but now it was spring, and the whole world was being reborn. FDR had gotten wind of what was going on in Europe back in the 30s, that the British had wanted Hitler to squash Russia for them, and that Britain was helping Hitler build up an army to do it. So FDR had started sending trucks and food and equipment to Stalin because America had many Russian friends, thanks to Hoover's food assistance program after the Great War. Hitler and Stalin had wanted to keep the perfidious Brits out of Poland, while America had more business ties with Germany and with Russia than with Britain. So when Britain declared war on Germany over Poland, FDR had continued to side with Russia and with Germany. America had recognized the Soviet government when Hitler was elected in 1933. And while the British press were saying that Hitler was going to invade England, FDR knew that was not true and had stayed neutral over Poland and France. The Chamberlain deal had been about giving back the port of Danzig to Hitler, and with the German Navy allowed to build ships again, the Royal Navy in Britain could demand more money from Parliament, and the Chamberlain Agreement was why Hitler had gone into Poland in the first place, because Chamberlain had given him permission to take back what had been stolen from him in the Versailles Treaty. Hitler also wanted Alsace-Lorraine back, where the spoken language was German. But France had a treaty with Poland that had been brokered by the British. So if Britain declared war over Poland, they would be able to invade Belgium, abandon France in a dramatic defeat at Dunkirk, give France to Hitler so the Americans would come over to save the French, and when the Americans lost the Battle of Normandy, Britain's debts to the U.S. from the Great War would be expunged. The British could invite the whole American army to use England as a staging area, and there the British would know the full extent of American military capability, and as soon as France fell, the French would be obviously siding with the enemy, a clear impetus for the British to move into North Africa and dislodge the French from the Mediterranean, beginning with the sinking of the French fleet. FDR sent the American army over to monitor the British, and Rommel was sent to North Africa to help the French keep the British out. And when FDR confronted Churchill about the murder of the French Admiral Darlan, Churchill's cold dismissal turned FDR firmly against him, ally or not. When Churchill and FDR met for the first time in Newfoundland in August of 1941, the Republican Supreme Court had just decided that FDR's New Deal was unconstitutional, but because the programs were already in place and people liked them, Congress continued to fund them. FDR spoke French and German, but not as well as Patton, who preferred French. And the French had actually asked the Germans to come save them from the British, who'd been planning to land in North Africa for quite some time, even well before their Ethiopian adventure ended in failure. On the 23rd of May, in 1945, the Americans told the British to arrest the Dönitz government in Flensburg, so the Americans finally showed up to tell them that it was over, and von Friedeberg died of cyanide poisoning that day while in British custody, and so did Eberhard Kinzel. Von Krosigk would be sentenced to 10 years for looting the Jews, but was released after 1 year on amnesty. And Jodl was sentenced to hang along with 9 others at Nuremberg, and Jodl's last words would be, "I greet you, my eternal Germany." Von Friedeberg had been the only one to sign all 3 surrenders, and Himmler was brought to Lüneburg on the day the Americans shut down the Flensburg government, and Himmler also died of cyanide poisoning in British custody that day. The British made a bad showing of it in Yugoslavia in the month of May, specifically at Bleiburg, when the communist partisans, who'd been supported by the British, helped in massacring all the people who had helped the Germans or the Americans, and uncounted mass graves were left in their wake. When the British took Himmler into custody, the BBC announced that Himmler died while, quote, "biting down on the doctor's fingers," close quote, and those words came out in a newspaper report after enough people had seen the doctor's injuries for word to have spread that there had been a struggle. It was said to have taken 12 minutes for Himmler to die, and although the bruises on his corpse were consistent with a forced suicide, the British story was that Himmler had been biting down on a cyanide capsule when a doctor tried to save his life by extracting it from between his teeth, and the British buried Himmler's body, but nobody survived who could reveal the gravesite for doing an autopsy, and at the time it simply didn't matter that one more Nazi was dead and everyone just wanted to move on. Many complaints reached Reims about facilities maintained for American prisoners of war who had been released and were awaiting shipment back to the United States, and the complaints were serious enough to warrant an inspection trip by Eisenhower to Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre, in company with several visiting U.S. senators, including Burton Wheeler of Montana, Albert W. Hawks of New Jersey, and Homer Capehart of Indiana, pre-war isolationists who had been outspoken advocates of finishing the job in Europe that meant confronting the Russians. At the sprawling Lucky Strike complex, the group toured the mess halls and bunkhouses with a throng of camp administrators and troops. Eisenhower carefully inspected the accommodations, sampled the food, and rigorously quizzed the camp personnel. He overlooked nothing, and before leaving, paused to address the soldiers of Camp Lucky Strike in his familiar stump style. He reminded the men about the plans for shipping them home aboard spacious, comfortable commercial liners. He offered them a choice. They could go home as planned, or double bunk day and night to get home double time. Amid the tumultuous roar of cheers and applause, one of the senators turned to Butcher. "I hope that fellow never decides to run against me in my state. He's got what it takes. I can see now why the GIs worship him. He speaks their language. He isn't high hat like you expect from the brass. He knows their problems, and they know it." Eisenhower at War, page 811 and 12. The book Blood and Honor told the story of a 10-year-old boy sent to a Hitler youth camp in Czechoslovakia, where a teacher, with his hand in a metal brace from an injury he'd gotten in the Great War, used the brace to hit the boys, especially when he'd been drinking. The locals would murder the boys if they were caught away from the school, and so the boys had grown close in their mutual suffering. And when Hitler's war ended, the author described himself and other starving boys riding a train that was traveling back towards Germany, and the train was being strafed and bombed by Americans and British and Russian planes. And while sick and starving and dying, the boys finally came across some real German soldiers, and an officer told them that the Americans were only a few miles away and that the Americans would take good care of the boys. But an SS officer overheard it and shot the German officer dead on the spot, accusing him of talking about surrender. And then the SS man said, "Heil Hitler," and walked away. The next time the train stopped, the boys learned that Hitler was dead and wept like babies, and they were finally stopped by an Austrian mob looking for Nazis to kill, but the boys were saved by Russian and British prisoners of war, who turned them over to the Americans, and most of the boys had studied English for 4 years in school, so they had no trouble speaking with the American soldiers, and this author had turned 13 years old in 1945 when the Nazis had given him a gun and some grenades, even though he wasn't able to throw the grenades very far during practice. On the 9th of May, General George Taylor, Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Infantry Division, accepted the final surrender from Germany's General Theodor Osterkamp, and the ceremony took place in Ellbogen, Czechoslovakia, in a small tavern called Zum Wiesenross, or the White Horse Inn. During the ceremonies at the tavern, General Osterkamp tried to stall for time. He asked whether the dateline Ellbogen, Czechoslovakia was not in error. "To my knowledge," General Osterkamp said, "this is Ellbogen, Sudetenland." I translated the general's concern to General Taylor, who flushed from his collar on up and shouted, "You tell him there is no such goddamn place as Sudetenland. We are here in Czechoslovakia, and that's what the document will read." I translated General Taylor's words in idiomatic German to retain their flavor. General Osterkamp immediately picked up the pen, signed the document, and the ceremonies were over. Klaus Barbie, The Shocking Story of How the U.S. Used This Nazi War Criminal as an Intelligence Agent, by Erhard Dabringhaus, Washington, D.C., Acropolis Books Limited, 1984, page 45. There had been one more piece of funny business before the bulge in the form of a minor attack on Alsace, to which Monty had demanded that Ike respond, and Ike knew that Monty's proposition would not only have isolated those Americans on the other side of the Vosges Mountains, but would have given the Germans an opportunity to cut off the American supplies coming up from Marseille. Strasbourg was 100 miles south of Frankfurt, and if Strasbourg were not defended, the Germans would have taken severe reprisals against any Strasbourgians who had helped the Americans, and Ike knew the fervor with which the true French were willing to take up antiquated arms against the de Gaullist Free French, and knew they would rather fight alongside the Vichy and welcome the Germans back than submit to England's de Gaulle. So Ike decided to keep the American army in Strasbourg, from where they could more easily march east towards Austria than if they were up north, filling the gap left by Bradley's filling the gap made by Monty's Arnhem adventure. Bradley's troops went north to fill Monty's gap while Patton stayed in place, and the Strasbourgians enjoyed their welcome American friends, and this was what had left the Americans so very thin in front of the Ardennes forest. Churchill had flown over to threaten Ike with civil war in France if the Americans did not defend Strasbourg, and these troops had thus not been available to respond during the bulge. Listening to the soft Norman rain splash the trees outside, the Supreme Commander paced the wooden floors of the map tent at his shell-burst advanced headquarters at Granville at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Dwight Eisenhower was waiting, patient and determined, for his visitor. He thought he knew exactly what Charles de Gaulle wanted this rainy August day: Paris. He was determined that he should not have it yet. Like de Gaulle, Eisenhower had learned a few hours earlier of the outbreak of fighting in the city. He had been damned mad when he found out about it. In his view, the Paris uprising posed, quote, just the kind of a situation I didn't want, a situation that wasn't under our control, that might force us to change our plans before we were ready for it, close quote. It was to force a change in those plans, Eisenhower was sure, that de Gaulle was coming to his shell-burst headquarters. He resented it. He saw it as another example of de Gaulle's annoying habit of, quote, trying to get us to change our plans to accommodate his political needs, close quote. For this American general at the head of the Allied armies, quote, the political aspects of Paris were secondary, close quote. He had only one concern: fighting Germans. He would let nothing, not even Paris, slow him down. As he heard the footfalls of his approaching visitor, he vowed once more, quote, "not to let myself get committed to Paris," close quote. Dour and moody, Charles de Gaulle stepped over the wet grass leading to the Supreme Commander's tent. He'd come home that morning in a plane running out of gas to an almost empty airstrip manned by an indifferent functionary to shave with a borrowed razor blade in order to lead his country. It was a nation in which millions knew his voice but did not know his face. He was a ghost to these millions, an ideal. He had now to give himself flesh and blood to embody the ideal, which must now become a political reality. For him the political aspects of Paris were supreme, with its communists already clamoring for authority. Charles de Gaulle had failed. Eisenhower had not agreed to modify his plans to move immediately on Paris. For the stooped and solemn man walking back to Marmier's plain, Eisenhower's answer now posed a cruel dilemma. It had faced de Gaulle with a terrible decision. A few moments before he had hinted to the frowning American before him what it might be. Stiffly correct, de Gaulle had told Eisenhower the liberation of Paris was a matter of such prime importance to France that, if he had to, he was prepared to withdraw the 2nd French Armored Division from the Allied command and send it to Paris on his own authority. Paris, for de Gaulle, was so crucial he was prepared to tear asunder 4 years of Allied unity to get it. Is Paris burning? How Paris miraculously escaped Adolf Hitler's sentence of death in August 1944 by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre, New York Pocket Cardinal edition. Simon & Schuster, 1965-66, page 144-7. The footnote read, Eisenhower had smiled. He had not taken the polite threat that seriously. He was convinced the 2nd Armor, quote, couldn't have moved a mile if I didn't want it to, and wouldn't have, close quote. Later, at a tenser moment of the war during the Battle of the Bulge, de Gaulle was to make a similar threat, this time about the divisions of the French First Army the Supreme Commander wanted to pull out of Strasbourg. Then an angry Eisenhower told him, "General, I'll keep those troops in Strasbourg as long as I can, but if you want to take those divisions back, you go right ahead. Just remember one thing. You won't get one more cartridge, one more pound of supplies, or one more gallon of gasoline. But if you want those divisions back, General, you go right ahead and take them back." 8 November 1944. We also had our weekly meeting with Sherwell and Sandys on the flying bomb and the rocket. I am afraid that both of these are likely to interfere with the working of Antwerp Harbor, a matter of the greatest importance in the future. I then had an interview with Joubert de la Fuerta, and he gave me some interesting sidelights on Mountbatten's HQ. He said that the Anglo-American relations continued to be bad, the Americans full of criticism of our management of India, and expressing openly the opinion that if they had their way, there would be no British Empire after the war! Exclamation point. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 619. And so problems remained, although accounts of Eisenhower's early February trip convey a feeling that the worst was over. Malta had come and gone, the Yalta meetings were continuing, but the Allies had weathered the German counteroffensive. In the years ahead, Eisenhower would occasionally reflect back on the folly of the German V-weapon program, which had been a prestige weapon pushed at the expense of jet aircraft production. That week, V-weapon attacks on Antwerp reached a peak, and yet millions of tons of supplies moved through the port practically without a hitch. Many, including Spatz, felt that the Germans might have been in a position to fight the war to a stalemate as late as January had the Me-262 jet been in full production. Eisenhower at War, page 675. Too bad Wildungen's shabby Furstenhof Hotel, where an odor of antiseptic still clung to the rooms that had been used by the Germans as hospital wards. The news of Hitler's death came on the evening of May 2 from Radio Hamburg with 3 rolls of muffled drums. 6 months before, that announcement would have called for wild celebration. Now it passed almost unnoticed, for on the eve of Germany's collapse the death of Hitler had been overshadowed by the greater tragedy of the nation whose destruction he had wrought. Grand Admiral Dönitz, the submariner, whose U-boats had sighted victory in their periscopes only 3 years before, had been named Hitler's successor. He went on the air with a pretentious pledge to continue the war against the Bolsheviks. Himmler's whereabouts were undisclosed, although intelligence reported peace feelers attributed to him. When Dittmar, who was then being held at Group for interrogation, was told of Himmler's bid for peace, he dismissed it scornfully. Himmler, he declared, could command no following whatsoever in the German army. Bradley, page 533 and 4. There were mountains of weapons and ammunition laying around that the British could have used to rearm the German POWs, and to get the Russians and the Americans into a shooting war may have been as easy as having the British SAS fire at the Russians in Berlin and blame it on the Americans, and then fire on the Americans while blaming it on the Russians. But everybody was so drunk by that time that most of the sniper fire was ignored as celebratory.